Hello and welcome to another installment of Hidden Collections. My name is Anna Barber and I'm the Curator of Exhibitions and Public Programs here at the Martha's Vineyard Museum. I'm thrilled to be joining you and here with our dear colleague, Research Librarian Bo Van Riper, who is once again going to be diving into the museum's collection to share with us the hidden histories, the untold stories, and surprising finds within the museum's archives that tell the story of our island. Before we begin, I'd like to remind everyone who's joining us near and far, if you are here on the island or if you're going to be visiting soon, we are open to the public, and we're not only adhering to state health and safety guidelines, but we're going above and beyond to ensure the safety of our visitors and staff. So we're installing new exhibits every month. So we'd love for you to come and visit if you are here and visit us. We're open Tuesday through Sunday, 10 to 4. And as always, we're grateful for the support of our members and our donors and encourage all of you, if you're able, to consider a membership to the museum right now. Your support helps us to continue our research, our publications, our exhibitions and programs like the one that we are offering for free today. So before I turn it over to Bo, I want to let you know that he will be taking questions at the end of his presentation. So if you've got something for him, just post it in the chat box or the question and answer box. And when Bo is done, we will get to them. So please feel free to ask away. As we all know, Bo is a never-ending treasure trove of information, font of knowledge, all of the other things. We're so lucky to have him on staff as our colleague, and I can think of an endless list of accolades, but I will spare him the embarrassment and pass it over to him. So thank you for joining us again, Bo. We'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Anna, for that wonderful introduction. And if you feel like sharing any accolades offline and in private, I will do my best to keep my embarrassment to a minimum. Hello, everybody. Welcome and happy February. And February being Black History Month, I wanted to start today with a relatively recent find, a literally hidden part of our collection, a letter from Captain William Martin, the master of a whaling ship that was on August 13th, 1889, docked in Norfolk, Virginia, making repairs after it had been caught in a storm. And Captain Martin was writing to Samuel Osborne Jr., the owner of the ship back in Edgartown. Now, this is interesting for two reasons, one of which is that Samuel Osborne was in 1889 not only one of the wealthiest people on Martha's Vineyard, but also one of the most prominent whale ship owners in the entire country. But the even more interesting reason that this is a remarkable letter is that William Martin was Black. He was the grandson of a formerly enslaved woman. He grew up the son of a single mother in Edgartown, attended the Edgartown public schools where he learned to read and write. And like many young men in Edgartown in the mid-19th century, he looked to the sea and specifically to whaling as a way to better himself. Over the course of a career lasting decades, he made over a dozen voyages, 3 of them as captain or joint captain. And he was writing to Osborne as captain here in August 1889, saying, in essence, I wanted to update you on my situation. Here's where things are. And this letter is one of a series of 8 letters which came to us from an unknown source as part of the Osborne family papers, and which surfaced last year in the course of me looking for the answer to somebody's question about Samuel Osborne. These 8 letters are the only, next please, letters from Captain Martin, who was the only African-American whaling captain from Martha's Vineyard, although one of many men of color who rose to command whale ships over the course of the 19th century. And these 8 letters, you can see his signature here at the bottom of page 2, William A. Martin. These 8 letters are the only letters from Martin to anyone known to exist anywhere. 3 of the letters recently went on display in our jewel box gallery up on the 2nd floor. And all 8 letters are in the copies of all 8 letters are in the hands of Skip Finley, whose book Whaling Captains of Color came out last year and gave us all a completely new perspective on the extent and the breadth of the role of sailors and mates and officers of color in the whaling industry. As Skip points out, the whaling industry, being a shared risk, shared reward capitalist venture, didn't care who your daddy was, what your race was, what they put down next to your name on the census. What they cared about was, could you find and catch and kill whales and make a profit for the owners? And as a result, a man like Martin, who would have been discriminated against and faced with limited options on land, was able to rise to a position of command and authority and make not only a decent living, but a prosperous living for himself. These letters make it clear, however, that for him, as for everyone who went to sea, whaling was not an easy living. And the letters read as a series give you a deep dive inside just how complicated it could be. The second mate ran off, several other men deserted, there was legal trouble with the port authorities, the sails were worn out and needed to be replaced, and so on and so forth. And Martin is carrying on this ongoing conversation, 8 letters in the space of a month, with his boss, the ship owner, asking what he should do and making recommendations on how to best get the voyage back underway. It's an extraordinary glimpse behind the scenes of the American whaling industry during its last decades, and an extraordinary glimpse into the life of Captain Martin, who was, by any stretch of the imagination, an extraordinary guy. Next, please. Perhaps you recognize this building. I hear they've turned it into a museum. This is obviously a postcard, and it's a postcard of the Marine Hospital. Notice that it says on the front there, scrawled at the bottom, Brother Frank, having a fine time, signed whoever it was. I think it's S. Gertrude. I don't know if S is for sister or whether S was the person's first name. But there are a couple of things I want to call your attention to about this postcard. One is, note the building behind the Marine Hospital, which was the original part of the 1879 Marine Hospital, which, before the 1895 one in the center of the picture was built, stood out on the front edge of the lawn. The building in back there had originally been built in the 1850s as the Holmes Hole Lighthouse. And instead of that cupola on the left, that spire on the left, it would have had a lighthouse lantern stuck in the roof line. When the 1895 Marine Hospital was built, the 1879 hospital was moved to the back of the property and used as a dormitory for staff. The extension that had been attached to it in 1885 was attached to the back of the 1895 building as a dining hall and kitchen wing. It's not visible in this picture because of the angle, but it was behind the main building, roughly where the Bodmin Courtyard is now. The other thing I want to call your attention to is the paint on the Marine Hospital. You can't see what color it is, but you can see that the shingles are all painted a uniform medium color, and the trim is picked out. The window frames and the corner trim and the vertical posts on the porch are picked out in what looks like white, with the decorative work below the balconies and the work of the balcony railings perhaps picked out in a darker color. And I want to call your attention to the fact that the message on the postcard was scrawled basically in the bottom margin on the front. Finally, note that in the bottom left corner it says published for C.M. Vincent. C.M. Vincent ran a newspaper and tobacco and variety store on Main Street in Vineyard Haven, where Mardell's gift shop is now at the corner of Main and Center Street. Next slide, please. And as you'll see, if you look again on the left edge there, this postcard was published by the Metropolitan News Company in Boston. It was published by the Metropolitan News Company, but for C.M. Vincent. Now, did the Metropolitan News Company have a random photograph of the Marine Hospital in Vineyard Haven sitting around in its files, and Vincent called them up and said, "I'll have 500 of that, please"? No, in all likelihood, Metropolitan News Company had a deal where if you, the retailer, wanted to send them an image and pay them whatever the wholesale price was for, say, 500 postcards, they'd take your image, print it on a postcard, and then mail you back the postcards, and you could sell them for whatever markup you wanted to the people in your store. Also note at the lower left corner, it says "this side for address." When this postcard was made around 1905, 10 years after the Marine Hospital was built, for those of you who are keeping score at home, this was how postcards worked. The side without the picture was reserved exclusively for the address, and whatever message you were going to write had to fit on the front side, which is why you see postcards with the messages scrawled on the bottom edge, and why they left a margin at the bottom edge so you didn't have to write the message over the picture. Postcards as we know them, with the front devoted wholly to the picture and the back divided into an address section on the right and a message section on the left, came in about 5 years or so later and were called, not surprisingly, divided back postcards. Next slide. You may notice something about this particular image, which is that it is exactly the same image as the 1-2 slides ago. It's just that this one, the photograph has been colored in. And I show it here to note that the take one image and repurpose it in multiple ways thing is not just a product of modern day social media feeds. It existed at the beginning of the 20th century as well. And as Barbara Murphy, my indefatigable cataloger of postcards, could tell you, you can find, if you look through a large collection of postcards like the Neil Wiseman collection here at the museum, not only black and white and color versions of this, but minute variations, like a version like the one you're looking at, except maybe there's a tree in front of it, or there's a person standing to one side of it that's been added in after the original photograph was taken to create a little extra variety and make the postcard look newer and fresher. Another thing to notice here is that now the color scheme is basically the same, uniform medium color on the shingles and trim picked out in white, but at least the artist who colored this is envisioning the building in a sort of overall gray-green color. Was that what it was actually painted in 1905 or 1910? Excellent question, but presumably the person who did this did it from at least a firsthand view or firsthand glance at it. If you've been on the site recently, and boy howdy, if you'd been on the site before about 2010, the other thing that's going to strike you is, where's all the vegetation? I mean, there's a lawn, but barely a single bush to be had. Maybe there are a few by the corners of the front porch, but even that's hard to tell. The trees that were eventually planted along the northern property line or along the edge of the escarpment are nowhere to be seen here. And in fact, as early as 1896 in the Surgeon General's report, the specific write-up about the Vineyard Haven Marine Hospitals, the chief surgeon said, basically, "Boss, it would be really good if we'd plant some trees. The wind up here blows something fierce and a windbreak would be great." So they got there, it just took them a while. Next slide, please. Now, if you look at this, there will be two things likely that will strike you. One is that the paint here appears, especially if you look at the front of the building, to be two-tone. The upper floor seems to be painted a darker color than the lower floor. Now, whether that's real or an optical illusion, I'm not entirely sure. I incline towards real. Whether this was before the previous picture was taken and the uniform paint scheme came later, or vice versa, we don't yet know. We'd love to know because it would help dating the pictures of the buildings, but we don't. Also note that all the windows are now fitted, as are all the windows are now fitted with what appear to be striped retractable cloth awnings, presumably on steel pipe frameworks that are hinged at the bottom to fold out from the building. The idea being presumably to shade the windows and make the building cooler in summer in an era before air conditioning, to keep direct sunlight from pouring through the windows and heating the building up, unless you wanted that to happen. Okay, next slide, please. The first lobster hatchery in Massachusetts was, of course, established at the head of the lagoon off County Road in Oak Bluffs back in 1939. It later became a part of the Martha's Vineyard Shellfish Group, where Rick Carney and his people did research on how to make shell fisheries on the island prosper through the use of tank-raised miniature shellfish that could then be transplanted into the island's ponds and whatnot. But back in the day when the lobster hatchery was, next slide please, entirely about lobsters, back in the day when it was filled with plastic tanks in which, next slide please, tiny microscopic, that's a 1-inch scale at the bottom, folks, lobsters gave way to, next slide please, lobsters that you could hold in the palm of your rubber-coated glove, next slide please, which gave way to lobsters that you could hold on the tip of your finger, which gave way to, next slide please, lobsters that you could, well, were about as big as a paperclip, although less useful for holding paper together, which gave way to color-coded lobsters, which you could hold comfortably in the palm of one hand, which gave way to the kind of thing that we all enjoy periodically, or some of us do, with drawn butter and coleslaw on the side. Back in the day when the lobster hatchery was about lobsters and nothing but lobsters, next slide, it was in the capable hands of a guy named John Hughes, shown here in his World War II gig as the captain of a minesweeper, someplace, judging by those mittens and parka he's wearing, pretty damn cold, who went on to, next slide please, become an oceanographer, marine biologist. That is John Hughes, not the one who directed Pretty in Pink, standing next to Alvin, not the one who sang trios with Simon and Theodore, on the deck of a Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution research vessel. John Hughes became, next slide, the first director of the lobster hatchery. Here he's holding up one of those rare blue lobsters, and you can see over his right shoulder the old lagoon drawbridge that was taken down in 2015 to make way for the current bridge. So he's standing right on the beach in front of the hatchery. John Hughes, who also contributed all these pictures to the museum's archives when he did an oral history interview with Lindsay Lee, was honored in 2012 by having the lobster hatchery named the John Hughes Research Facility. And if you've been following the story in the papers, it's recently been made available to the Fishermen's Preservation Trust as part of an ongoing process of keeping inshore fisheries sustainable on the vineyard and a viable lifestyle for those who pursue them on the vineyard into the 21st century. So Here's to the memory of John Hughes, expert on all things lobster, and the person who put the Lobster Hatchery on the path to success. Next slide, please. This one's from John Hughes as well, the fishing vessel Stanley Fisher. And I include it here because there are all kinds of pictures of fishing vessels out under bright blue skies on calm waters, and it looks like it's the best, most wonderful job in the world. This is just a gentle reminder here on a February day, next slide please, that sometimes your fishing boat looks like this. When the waves are breaking over the deck and it's so cold outside that the salt water freezes on everything it touches, and periodically you've got to send the crew out on the deck with a hatchet in one hand and the other hand on the lifeline so they can hack the ice off the ship so that it doesn't develop a center of gravity too much higher than its center of buoyancy and roll over, which generally speaking, when it happens to you in a boat, can ruin your whole day. The bigger the boat, the more likelihood your day is going to be ruined. So fishing in the winter, like whaling in the 19th century, not always the easiest or the warmest way to make a living. And we've got John Hughes to thank for this amazingly rare reminder of just how cold it could get out there in the waters around the vineyard. Next slide, please. These are some slightly different vineyard waters. This is, as it says there at the top, Lake Tashmu, and that's the Tashmu Springs pumping station, which you can still visit down on a driveway off West Spring Street, just near the Tashmu overlook. But that's not why I want to call your attention to this particular image of it. I want to call your attention to this particular image of it just to point out that this postcard from probably about 1910, maybe 1915, is a picture postcard of a public utility, of a pumping station, a waterworks with a steam engine, that's why the big chimney, and a set of pumps and the whole 9 yards. I mean, think about that. This is an absolutely gorgeous artist rendition of a bucolic scene, but the centerpiece is not a placidly grazing sheep or some woman in a flowing white dress with a parasol with her arms outstretched running through a field of buttercups. It's a utilitarian brick building designed to provide clean, potable water to the people of Greater Tisbury. It's interesting, it seems to me, not only because, I mean, can you imagine going to Mardell's or Leslie's or the corner store or whatever today and picking up a beautiful photochrome postcard of, I don't know, the parking lot at the Steamship Authority, the Lagoon Drawbridge, the Edgartown wastewater treatment plant? Public utility buildings, the waterworks in Tisbury, the waterworks in Oak Bluffs, the standpipes at Edgartown and Vineyard Haven were frequent subjects for postcards and for pictures taken for commercial sale at the beginning of the 20th century, in part because the transformation from everybody's got their own well to towns have municipal water systems and pumping stations was just beginning. And the idea of a municipal pumping station was not only a remarkable and extraordinary thing for people who'd grown up in a world of backyard pumps, it was a sign of modernity and progress and a point of civic pride. And look, we have paved streets, we have electric street lamps, we have municipal water pumped by the state-of-the-art steam-driven pumping station. We are a cutting edge, happening 20th century kind of place. Vision of a different world not so long ago. And next slide, please. Not all our hidden collections are quite ours yet. This one, a scan of a letter written February 9th, 1862, arrived in my inbox last night from John Clow, a member of the vast and accomplished Clow family of Vineyard Haven. It's a letter from Captain Benjamin Clow to his brother George, who was a farmer up in Maine. And it's, as many 19th century letters are, a single sheet of paper folded in half. That's page 1 on the right with the heading, page 4 with the signature, yours, Benjamin, on the left, and then next slide, pages 2 and 3 on the, back one, please, thank you. Pages 2 and 3 on the interior, which means that 19th century letters are sometimes complicated to digitize because you've either got to do the first and fourth pages separately or remind people to look back for page 4. What's interesting here is the wonderful everyday ordinariness of the letter. It starts off, well, the folks have gone to church, it's Sunday, so I guess I'll take the opportunity to write you a few lines, and, goes on into, it hasn't been much of a winter yet, but the pond's frozen over and there were 200 people ice skating on it. And John and I had the same reaction. 200 people ice skating? Where? Our consensus was probably Tashmu, which froze over regularly in those days, before the channel was opened to the sea in 1938, and it went from being mostly fresh to part fresh and part salt. Benjamin Clow goes on, there's been quite a religious revival here. There were 7 people sprinkled at the Methodist Church just last week, and he names some of them, including Captain Henry W. Beadle, who was Henry Beadle Huff's grandfather. Benjamin goes on to say that he's been collecting rockweed, presumably as fertilizer for the gardens up at the lighthouse, that would be West Shop, and further mentions that if he could get 15 pounds of potatoes from his brother George at a reasonable price, he'd be most pleased to have that. He mentions that his son Benny, that is to say Benjamin Clow Jr., wandered by and piped up, "Please tell Uncle George and Grandpa Clow that I've been a good boy," and that his 2.5-year-old little brother popped in and said, "Me too," which I think is my favorite detail in the entire letter, in that anybody who's had small children running around underfoot can totally imagine that happening when they're on the phone or on a video chat or whatever. Because our images of 19th century children come to us from posed formal portraits where they're all done up in their Sunday best and looking very, very serious, like miniature versions of Grover Cleveland or Emily Dickinson. We have this image of 19th century children as incredibly grave and serious. And of course, sometimes they were, as children today are incredibly grave and serious sometimes. But then you get a glimpse like this, and you realize that the lens through which we see 19th century kids is, in part, controlled by the representations of them that have survived, and that live and in person, kids were kids in 1862 as too in 2021. Next slide, please. As it says on the sign over the door, this is the Rice Playhouse, located on Brewster Avenue on East Chop. It started life in the 1920s as an adjunct to the Fidela Rice School of the Spoken Word, started by an actor from the mainland who, in the summers at Oak Bluffs, ran a residential school where you could learn acting and elocution and so on and so forth. Rice and his wife and some colleagues from his theatrical company on the mainland ran the School of the Spoken Word from the early 1920s on through 1940, when a woman student at the school was murdered in her dormitory room, and suspicion fell on Fidela Rice's brother, Ralph Huntington Rice, who was on the staff of the school. The trial at the Dukes County Superior Court unfolded over the course of several weeks in 1940. It was covered by all the Boston papers. Murders being relatively rare on Martha's Vineyard, it was a cause célèbre. And although Ralph Huntington Rice was acquitted on the minor technicality that there was no physical evidence and no compelling reason to believe, other than, quote, he looked funny, unquote, that he might have been responsible, the trial and the subsequent bad publicity had the predictable effect on the Rice School of the Spoken Word, and it closed down after the 1941 season. The playhouse was vacant, next slide, over the course of World War II. But as you'll notice from this picture, it was a substantial structure. The front you were looking at before in that postcard was around the far left corner of the building you can see here. The building extended back through the lobby, which is the lower left part of this structure, and the theater itself was the multi-story bit you can see on the right of the picture by the utility pole there. That's a huge space. It was the biggest purpose-built live theater on the island, and Rice had pioneered the idea of doing summer stock theater with professional actors. He used the people at his school as minor players and stagehands and understudies and whatnot, but the major roles were played by professional actors from the mainland who made a little money and got to hone their craft and, well, hang out in oak bluffs and go to the beach during the day between rehearsals. So after World War II, next slide. This is a playbill from one of the late seasons of the Fidela Rice Playhouse, the Island Playgoer, featuring Eleanor Phelps, who was one of those professional actors who played the leads. Next slide, please. In the years following World War II, from about 1946 up to about 1956, the Rice Playhouse reopened under new management and ran a mixture of modern plays and old favorites, like in 1951, virtually the entire oeuvre of George Bernard Shaw, including in this particular case, Pygmalion. You'll notice that the design there next to Pygmalion and above Rice Playhouse is the vineyard turned 90, the outline of the vineyard turned 90 degrees and modified to look like one of those masks that you see symbolizing comedy and drama that collectively represent the theater. I'm torn between thinking that that's a clever bit of graphic design and it looks like something that you'd see in the deepest, darkest depths of your nightmares. So, take your pick. The second incarnation of the Rice Playhouse, which kept the name but didn't involve Fidela Rice or anybody related to a murder suspect or otherwise, lasted through the mid-1950s when, for lack of support, lack of viewership, it shut down for good and the bits were auctioned off. One minor thing in passing, one of the people involved with its 1950 incarnation was a fellow named Lithgow, whose son John went on to have a not inconsiderable acting career himself on the stage and in film and television. A young John Lithgow actually spent the summer right after World War II in a sprawling house on East Chop that his father rented for the family while he was working as a publicist and whatnot for Rice Playhouse. Next slide, please. The large pooch in these pen and ink drawings, I suspect, needs no or very little introduction. That is, of course, Clifford the big red dog, in two panels. Next slide, please. From a book called Clifford's Pals by Edgartown resident since from 1969 until his death, Norman Bridwell. Norman Bridwell was born in Kokomo, Indiana, and he had a ambition by the time he graduated high school to put his talents for drawing to use as a professional illustrator. So he went to art school, first at the Indiana University and then at Cooper Union in New York, and was a professional illustrator for 15 years, got married, and his wife said, you know, we've got this infant daughter, Emily Elizabeth, and the bills are getting higher, and maybe you should try and break into the children's book market. So Bridwell shopped his portfolio around to 12 or 15 publishers, none of whom were particularly interested, several of whom said, you'll never make it in this business, go back to designing neckties, which was part of what he was doing. But one editor at Harper and Row looked at a painting he'd done of an enormous red bloodhound and a little girl and said, you know, maybe you should try taking one of these pictures and writing a children's story around it. Maybe this one. That looks like it could be a cool story. So Bridwell, happy for any kind of encouragement, went home and in 3 days dashed off a story that he called Clifford the Big Red Dog. Clifford became a little less bloodhoundy and a little more generic doggy. He got bigger. He went from horse size to house size. He acquired the name Clifford from the name of Bridwell's wife's, Norma's, imaginary childhood friend. Bridwell had wanted to name the dog Tiny, and Norma looked at him and said, well, that's a stupid name for a big dog. So Clifford it was. The little girl became Emily Elizabeth after Bridwell's own little girl. His son got his moment in the sun in a series of books about witches and monsters that Bridwell wrote later in his career. And Clifford was sent off to Scholastic Books, which in the space of about 3 weeks said, yes, we would love to publish this. And 39 more Clifford books, 3 animated television series, and an uncalculable amount of Clifford merchandise later. Norman Bridwell of Kokomo and later New York and finally Edgartown was the creator of one of the most beloved children's book icons of the 20th century. I'm going to pause very briefly and put down the blind so I'm not getting the sun in my face. I will be right back. Next slide, please. The previous 2 images and also this image are from a collection of Clifford artwork that Norman Bridwell donated to the museum in 2014. And you'll notice that it looks like Clifford's being struck square on the nose by a bolt of lightning, but that's not actually lightning. That's the reflection of the overhead light in the sheet of clear acetate that's taped over this drawing. And if you look at this in person, which you're all welcome if you'd like to come do at the library, you'll notice that the acetate carries all the black bits of the picture: Clifford's nose and pupil, his collar, Emily Elizabeth's skirt, her friend's hair, and so forth. If you lift up the acetate, the color is all painted on the paper underneath, and the areas that show up in black in the final bit are filled in a kind of gray blue to indicate where the black goes, but the actual black is in the acetate overlay. One of those things which, if you've only had the opportunity to see Clifford's artwork in its final published form, or unless you work in the children's book industry, you'd probably never know. I didn't know until I cataloged the Norman Bridwell collection yesterday and went to take a picture of this and went, whoa, that's cool. Next slide, please. This is a map numerically coded for your convenience. And as you can see in the upper left there, it's a map of Cottage City that was made in 1880. Now, those three numbered areas represent, from left to right, number one is what's called the Copeland District. That is to say, the commercial real estate operation that was established immediately after the Civil War by the people who laid out Ocean Park and Woburn Park and Niantic Park and all those other parks, who laid out the streets of everything between Circuit Avenue and the ocean, everything between Oak Bluffs Harbor and Farm Pond, and we're doing this as a commercial enterprise. Area 2 is the campground with the tabernacle just by the tail of the 2 there. And Area 3 is Vineyard Highlands, another completely separate commercial real estate development that runs from basically the East Chop Lighthouse at the far lower right corner of Area 3, all the way to the edges of Oak Bluffs Harbor. Next slide, please. You can see in this section that Circuit Avenue, which is that zigzaggy line that runs between Area 1 and Area 2, neatly cleaves off the campground on the right, Area 2, from the Copeland District, so named because Robert Morris Copeland was the landscape architect who laid out the street plan, on the left. When the campground officials put up a fence along the what's now Linda Jean's side of Circuit Avenue to keep the riffraff from the Oak Bluffs district out of the campground, that line between 1 and 2 was where the fence originally ran. By this point, 1880, it had been taken down because the riffraff from Oak Bluffs turned out to be more reasonable neighbors than the campground folks had feared. Next slide. Vineyard Highlands was one of many real estate developments, a dozen or more, that were started in the aftermath of the success of Oak Bluffs. And you'll notice that it basically starts where that mitten-shaped thing outlined in orange at the lower left ends. That mitten-shaped thing is Lake Anthony, not yet, you will notice, connected to Vineyard Sound and turned into Oak Bluffs Harbor. Where the thumb of the mitten touches the orange line that runs along the shore is where the present day entrance to Oak Bluffs Harbor is. The fingers of the mitten are basically where the Highlands Bathing Pavilion was then and the East Chop Beach Club is now. That circle in the very center of area number 3 was the Baptist Temple, a large open-air wooden structure where the Baptists, who had their own campground here in Vineyard Highlands, held their August camp meetings and worship services. If you drop straight down from that circular feature past the fingers of the mitten, you'll notice an orange line sticking out perpendicular to the coast. That was Highland Wharf, where if you wanted to take the steamer to Oak Bluffs and get off and go directly into the Methodist campground over in Area 2 by the back door, you would get off at Highland Wharf and thus not have to sully your whatever by passing through the secular resort of Oak Bluffs with its shooting galleries and roller rinks and other temptations. If you look carefully, there's a railroad track running from the base of Highland Wharf all the way along the edge of the mitten and then taking a sharp left turn around the base of the mitten before it heads up into the campground. That was the track of the old Oak Bluffs horse railway that ran from the Highland Wharf all the way in, made a loop around Trinity Circle and came back. It made that turn at the base of the mitten right where our market is now. And the horse barn where they stored the horses and the carts when they weren't in use was a little way up the road from our market towards the wharf. Nowadays, much repurposed. It's an apartment complex. Next slide, please. There are two things I want to call your attention to before we leave this map, one of which is all these sort of fluffy cloud-like bits in the nooks and crannies of Vineyard Highlands, which are tiny little pocket parks. It wasn't just the Copeland District that had more parks than you could shake a stick at. It was the Highlands as well. But if you also look, the fluffy bit in that curved street, Winthrop Avenue, is labeled Telegraph Hill, which is interesting because East Chop Light, which is at the far right of this close-up of the map, is generally said to have been built on top of Telegraph Hill, the site of an old circa 1800 semaphore telegraph tower. A story for another day. Whether Telegraph Hill was mislabeled on this map or whether the semaphore telegraph was really where Winthrop Avenue is now, and the sign that used to, and come to think of it, still does hang out by the East Chop Light is wrong, is one of those questions requiring further investigation. By the way, the diagonal street at the far left of this close-up, Brewster Avenue, that was where the Rice Playhouse was. Next slide. There's a close-up of the Baptist Temple and the circle around it and the circle of trees around the circular temple. I mentioned this for two reasons. One is that the Baptist Temple is long since gone. It was pulled down in the 1930s. The circle, the circular track around it, and the circle of woods around that are still there. And if you've ever wondered why there's an empty, overgrown circular path just inshore from Washington Park and the East Chop Beach Club, that's why. Because once upon a time in the late 1870s, 1878 to be precise, the Baptists built a wooden open-air temple there. Next slide. A beautiful, round, open-air temple with a cupola on top. And the Methodists looked at it and said, wow, that's really cool. That's a lot better than putting up a 5,000 square foot canvas tent every summer. Man, we should get us one of those. But you know what? What if we built it in wrought iron? And in 1879, the thing that we all think of as the tabernacle, the Methodist Tabernacle, the tabernacle that still stands in Trinity Park, went up. But it started as an idea with the wooden Baptist temple built in the middle of what's now an empty circle in the woods. That's it for this edition of Hidden Collections, but if we have questions, I'm happy to take them, and thank you all for coming out and being a part of this.
Okay, we do have one question, and if anyone else has something burning they'd like to know, now is your last shot to post a question in the Q&A or the chat box as well. We do have one question that is, other than Judy Blume, are there other children's book authors who called the island their home?
Great question. It is my recollection that Mark Brown, who wrote the Arthur books, is or was a summer resident of the Vineyard at one point. And I would not be surprised if there are other people who were principally known as children's book authors who happen to be residents, summer residents or otherwise, the Vineyard, but I can't think of any off the top of my head. I'd note that a non-trivial number of people who are residents of the Vineyard, better known for other things, ranging from Carly Simon, who did a couple of books on about Midnight Farm, where the animals get up and dance in the moonlight. Margot Datz, who restored the mural at the back of the Whaling Church and is responsible for all kinds of other amazing art across the island, and the late, great Shirley Mayhew, who did a story about the day in 1960 when the circus came to Oak Bluffs and the Islander, for the first and probably last time, carried elephants on the freight deck. And doubtless there have been others, but Norman Bridwell and Judy Blume and Mark Brown are the big three that I can think of. And because I've walked by them more times than I can imagine, more times than I can remember, I would call your attention to the fact that Norman Bridwell, because he was an awesome human being and loved kids, donated 2 original Clifford pictures to the pediatrics department at the hospital, and they hang on the wall outside, as I recall, Dr. Miller's office. But what I found out when I was cataloging the collection is that they are actually from original images from Clifford and the Grouchy Neighbors, which was Norman Bridwell's favorite of all his 49 Clifford books. So see previous comment about because he was an awesome human being. So if there are any other questions, I would be happy to.
Yeah, so there were a couple of just additions. Roald Dahl, which is the members of the Dahl family are still very much here on the island. But a question about that, there was a question mark from Pamela, and Kate Pfeiffer was mentioned as well as someone. And I remember one of my early childhood embarrassing mother memories of watching her run down Circuit Avenue after Shel Silverstein trying to get a signature of his, who lived in the campgrounds and would often walk around, was a favorite of ours. So there's one more comment about the Baptist Temple site is now owned and maintained by the East Chop Association. Thank you, Lori, for that comment as well.
Excellent point. Yeah.
And no more questions, I don't think. Oh, sorry. Yes. Oh, I'm seeing all of them. Yes. Shel Silverstein. Thank you, June. Meredith. Hey, Meredith is asking, was the Rice School building torn down?
The Rice School, when it was running as the School of the Spoken Word before World War II, was actually a complex of buildings. There was the playhouse, there was the classroom building, and there were, I believe, at least 2 dormitories. The theater itself was torn down. I believe at least one of the dormitories may have been repurposed as a private home. It may have been moved from the original site, however. Anybody who's interested in this, shoot me an email at bvanriper@mvmuseum.org, and I will, as they say in the White House press room, circle back to you on that, because I know we've got information about what happened to the buildings after the Playhouse shut down.
Okay, thank you, Bo. Let's see, there are just a couple more that came through. Polly Burroughs was mentioned as a wrote the Honey Boat. Not sure of the author illustrator of A Child's Guide to Martha's Vineyard. Oh, that's right.
Oh yeah, Alison Convery. One of the cornerstone books of my childhood. And Alison, I apologize if that makes you feel old. That wasn't my intention, but I do love the book.
Let's see here. Oh, June says, Mark Brown bought our great-grandmother's former home in Aquinnah, which he sold about 30 years ago. So there you have that. Yeah. Let's see here. Question from Joanne. We have always heard that the Baptist Tabernacle burned down long ago, but the Oak Bluffs Tabernacle remains since it was built of iron.
That's a widely circulated story, but it turns out it's not true. When the Baptists stopped using the temple as a temple, it was transferred to the East Chop Association, and the East Chop Association dismantled it, but it did not in fact burn. It was in apparently, judging by the news stories, fairly severe disrepair by the time it was taken down in the 30s, but there was never a fire. And in fact, we have images, not good images, but images of signs as late as maybe 1932, up at the head of the steamer wharf announcing Sunday services at the Baptist Temple. So it hung on right until a point where it was, where it ceased to be a site for worship and was taken down. I'm guessing as a liability issue, but I don't know that for certain.
All right, so I think we have time for just one more. There's a question here from Doug. Is the East Chop Tennis Club a piece of rice?
Good question. To the best of my knowledge, although I see where you're coming from, the look and feel of the building is definitely very similar, but I've never seen any evidence that that any part of the rice complex was ported down there. And I believe the beach club tennis, oh no, wait, you're saying tennis club, not beach club, my bad. Still very similar in outline. I have still never seen any evidence that part of the playhouse or surrounding complex was taken that far inland and repurposed. But maybe it's out there and we haven't found it yet, because as the Martin letters prove, stuff that we didn't think we knew we had that surfaces unexpectedly is part of the job and part of why it's fun.
So there's a flurry of questions coming through. I think we could do one more. My apologies to all of you who have commented, and let's see here. Hold on. Okay, so I'm wondering, Savannah, if we could go back to the pumping station postcard. There's a question about that. What is the gray structure to the right of the pumping station in the postcard?
I know exactly the structure you mean, and that is a great question to which I do not currently know the answer. I'm sure there is somebody out there who does, and I just need to figure out who that is, because you are not the first person to wonder that, nor am I.
All right. Well, thank you all for your participation. Thank you for joining us. Especially thank you to Bo for doing all of this wonderful work and uncovering and sharing the stories from our archives and from our collections. We hope that in the next month you continue to stay safe, all of you out there who are with us, and we will see you again next month. Stay tuned. Thank you all so much.
Thanks, everybody. See you in March.